The words hit me like a hammer coming down hard on something fragile. Your work is useless. We're shutting down this department. The conference room went completely silent. I mean the kind of silent where you can hear the air conditioning. Phones stopped mid-scroll. Pens hovered over notebooks without touching them. Every single person in that room looked up and their eyes moved back and forth between me and Mr. Doyle like they were watching something fall from a very great height and waiting for it to hit the ground. My coffee cup was in my hand. I felt it trembling, just slightly, and a small stream of hot liquid ran over the edge and spread across the polished conference table in a thin dark line. I did not move to wipe it up. My name is Marcus Reed. I had spent 5 years building that department from nothing. I had designed the strategies, created the workflows, built the client relationships, and pushed through innovations that nobody else at that company had been willing to attempt. I had done it with a small team, a modest budget, and more late nights than I could count. And in one sentence, standing in front of 12 people, Mr. Doyle had declared every single bit of it worthless. I sat very still and kept my face completely calm. To understand what happened in that conference room, you have to go back 6 months. Because what Mr. Doyle did that morning was not a sudden decision. It was the final step in something that had been building quietly for a long time. 6 months earlier, I had submitted a major client engagement proposal. I had worked on it for 3 weeks. Late evenings, early mornings, multiple drafts. The research alone took 9 days. When I handed it in, I genuinely believed it was some of the best strategic work I had produced in my career. Mr. Doyle called me into his office the following afternoon. He was smiling in the way he always smiled when he had already made a decision and was simply informing you of it. "We're going to present this as a collaborative effort," he said. "Assign it through Marcus's team, with broader input credited." I understood what that meant. The proposal would be presented to executives with my name nowhere near the front of it. A junior manager named Mr. Tunde would be listed as the point of contact. The strategy one had built would wear someone else's name like a borrowed coat. I noticed the small satisfied flicker in Mr. Doyle's eyes as I nodded and left. He knew exactly what he was doing. And at that point, so did I. That proposal reassignment would have been easy to dismiss as a one-time management decision. Except it was not one time. Over the following months I started tracking things. Not obsessively, just carefully. The way you track a sound you keep hearing in the walls of a building. You want to know if it is random or if it follows a pattern. What I found followed a very clear pattern. Emails I had sent to senior executives were being intercepted and edited before they arrived. Not deleted, edited. Small changes. A line removed here. A recommendation softened there. Enough to make my contributions look less precise, less confident, less necessary. I only discovered this because one executive, Ms. Abera, forwarded one of these emails back to me by mistake. The version she had received was noticeably different from the one I had sent. Meetings were being scheduled without me. Not every meeting, just the ones where my department's work was being discussed and evaluated. I would find out about them afterward, sometimes through Pete, who sat close enough to the executive floor to hear things. None of it looked deliberate if you only saw one piece. But I was seeing all the pieces now. And together they formed a very clear picture of a man who had decided I needed to disappear. The night after Ms. Abera's accidental email forward, I sat at my kitchen table and made a decision. I was not going to panic. I was not going to storm into Mr. Doyle's office with accusations I could not yet fully prove. I was not going to complain to colleagues and let word get back to him that I was rattled. Any of those responses would have handed him exactly what he needed, a reason to label me as difficult, unstable, a problem that needed to be managed. Instead I started saving everything. Every email I sent, I blind copied to my personal account. Every presentation I produced, I saved a time-stamped version in a private secure folder. Meeting notes from sessions where my ideas were discussed and then attributed elsewhere, I wrote those up the same evening and stored them with dates attached. Any document that bore my name in its original version, I kept the original. I also made a quiet phone call to a corporate attorney named Ms. Farrow, the same lawyer who had helped a colleague of mine navigate a contract dispute 2 years earlier. I explained the situation in broad terms. She asked careful questions. At the end of the call she said, "Keep doing exactly what you're doing. Document everything. Don't discuss this internally with anyone you don't fully trust." If Mr. Doyle wanted war, I was going to be ready before he even knew the fight had started. The official memo arrived on a Wednesday morning. I read it twice at my desk before I did anything else. Effective the following Friday, my department would be dissolved. Team members would be redistributed to other divisions. All ongoing projects would be transferred to the Central Strategy Unit, which reported directly to Mr. Doyle. The memo used words like streamlining and organizational efficiency. It was written in the clean, bloodless language that companies use when they want something to sound reasonable. My inbox filled up over the next 2 days. Messages from colleagues across the building. Some were genuinely sympathetic. A few were the corporate equivalent of a polite shrug, "Best of luck in your next chapter," and similar phrases that meant nothing in particular. One came from a junior member of my team named Kofi, who simply wrote, "This isn't right. Everyone knows it." I answered each message briefly and professionally. I thanked people for their kind words. I did not say anything about what I knew or what I had prepared. I did not hint that anything was coming. Because something was coming. The closure of my department was not an ending. It was a pressure point. And Mr. Doyle, in his confidence, had just pushed on something he did not fully understand. The company had not seen the last of me. Not even close. Here is something Mr. Doyle did not consider carefully enough when he shut down my department. The intellectual property did not disappear with the org chart change. Over 5 years, I had produced a significant body of work, strategic frameworks, client analysis models, workflow architecture, process blueprints. Much of this work had been formally submitted under my name, approved under my name, and in several cases signed by me as the originating author. The documentation existed in the company's own record system with clear authorship trails. Mr. Doyle had assumed that because he controlled my position, he controlled my output. That is a very common mistake made by people who confuse authority over a person with authority over what that person has created. He did not control the authorship records. He did not control the metadata on the original files. He did not control the submission timestamps or the email trails showing who had developed what and when. And he certainly did not control the fact that several of those frameworks were now embedded in the company's most critical ongoing processes, including the ones being positioned as central to a major acquisition deal that the board had been quietly preparing for months. I knew about the acquisition. I had known about it for longer than Mr. Doyle realized. And I understood, with complete clarity, exactly how much of what would be presented to those investors had originated in my department. About 3 weeks after my department closed, the company held an informal investor relations event. The kind of gathering that is not quite a formal meeting, drinks, light conversation, relationship maintenance. I attended because I was still technically employed, my role now listed vaguely as Senior Strategic Advisor, while HR figured out what to do with me. I was standing near the side of the room with a glass of water when one of the investors, a calm, well-dressed man named Mr. Osei, began talking to Mr. Doyle about the company's client integration process. He was describing it approvingly, walking through the logic of how it had been designed. Then he paused and turned slightly and said, almost as a passing thought, "The architecture here, this is what Mark has designed, isn't it?" It was a casual remark. The kind you make when you are simply giving credit where it is obvious. But in that room, at that moment, it landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripple moved outward silently. Mr. Doyle's smile did not waver. But something behind his eyes shifted. He said something smooth and vague about team contributions. He moved the conversation forward quickly. I did not say a single word. I stood where I was and sipped my water. But I had seen Mr. Doyle's jaw tighten for just 1 second. And I filed it away with everything else. Ms. Abera had been a senior executive at the company for 7 years. She was careful, observant, and not easily impressed. She had also been one of the few people in leadership who had consistently engaged with my department's output on its actual merits rather than through the lens of who was presenting it. After the department closure, she found me in the building's small library, a quiet room that most people forgot existed, and sat across from me without any introduction to the topic. "I've been watching what's been happening," she said simply. I did not pretend to misunderstand her. "I know," I said. She told me she had noticed the altered emails. She had noticed the missing meeting invitations. She had noticed that presentations carrying my department's work had been reaching senior leadership with different framing than what she knew I had originally submitted. "I haven't said anything officially," she said. "Not yet. But I want you to know, when the time comes and someone needs to confirm what actually happened here, I will." She left before I could respond with more than a nod. But that conversation shifted something for me. I had been operating alone for months. Carefully, deliberately alone, because I could not afford to trust the wrong person. But Ms. Abera was not the wrong person. She was the kind of ally who waits for the right moment and then holds the line without flinching. I was no longer entirely on my own. Mr. Doyle made the mistake that overconfident people almost always make eventually. He started performing his victory before it was complete. In the weeks following my department's closure, he referenced the streamlining decision in meetings as evidence of his strategic clarity. He mentioned it during an all-staff address as an example of the company's commitment to focused operations. He allowed it to become part of his public narrative, the decisive leader who had cut unnecessary weight and sharpened the organization. The problem with performing a victory too early is that it locks you into a story. And when the facts beneath that story start to shift, you cannot quietly adjust anymore. You have already told everyone what happened. You are now committed to a version of events. Meanwhile, I was not performing anything. I was working. I was answering questions from the few colleagues who still came to me informally for advice. I was reviewing the acquisition preparation documents that were being quietly circulated, documents that referenced processes and frameworks I had built. And I was continuing to document everything, date everything, store everything. He was celebrating in public. I was preparing in private. Any reasonable observer watching both of us during that period would have thought he was winning. That was fine. I did not need to look like I was winning. I needed to actually win. And those are very different things. 3 weeks before the acquisition announcement, I submitted a formal request under the company's internal protocol for an operational audit of projects currently in development. This was not an unusual request. The protocol existed specifically for situations where ongoing work needed to be reviewed for accuracy and proper process documentation. Any senior employee above a certain level could initiate it. I was still technically employed at that level. So I submitted the request through the correct channels, using precise and neutral language, citing standard process verification as my reason. Mr. Doyle was informed of the audit request, as was required by protocol. He called it routine in a message to the executive team. He was not concerned. Why would he be? The audit was a standard process review. It would go through the usual channels. It would confirm that projects were on track. It would be filed and forgotten. What Mr. Doyle did not realize was that a proper operational audit requires the review of original documentation, including authorship records, version histories, and submission trails for every process and framework currently in use. Every document that audit touched was going to point somewhere. And the somewhere it was going to point was directly back to the work I had produced and the name that had been quietly removed from it. I smiled a little when the audit confirmation landed in my inbox. Just to myself. Quietly. The audit ran over 2 weeks. During that time I attended several internal team calls where the results of various project reviews were being discussed. The lead auditor, a thorough and unhurried man named Mr. Nwosu, was working through documents methodically. At one of these calls, he raised a question about workflow documentation for the client integration system currently being prepared for the acquisition presentation. He noted that the original submission records showed one authorship trail while the current internal versions reflected a different one. He asked for clarification on when and why the documentation had been updated. Mr. Doyle was on that call. He gave a smooth answer about standard version control and team contributions. Mr. Nwosu made a note. He said he would need to review the original file metadata directly. After the call ended, Pete messaged me. His message was 2 words, "He's rattled." I did not reply immediately. I sat and thought about how the next few weeks were going to unfold. Mr. Doyle was still confident. I could hear it in how he answered Mr. Nwosu's question. But confidence under pressure and genuine calm are very different things, and I had been watching this man long enough to hear the difference. The crack was small. Barely visible. But it was there. The acquisition was not a small deal. The company had been in quiet negotiations for over a year with a significant regional partner, and the final announcement was going to be made at a formal investor presentation in front of board members, external partners, and senior leadership. The preparation for that event was consuming nearly every department in the building. And at the center of that preparation, the strategic frameworks being used to demonstrate organizational value, the client analysis models showing market positioning, the workflow architecture proving operational readiness, was my work. Not attributed to me. Not labeled with my name. But mine, in every meaningful sense of the word. I had known this moment was coming. I had structured my documentation specifically with this kind of high-visibility event in mind. Every framework I could trace to my original submissions was catalogued. Every model had a paper trail leading back to my desk. Investors would be in that room asking hard questions. They would want specifics. They would want to understand who had built what and how it worked. That was the nature of acquisition due diligence. You do not commit significant resources to a company without understanding the actual foundations of its value. Mr. Doyle was preparing to walk into that room and present my foundations as his own architecture. He had done it before, in smaller rooms, with smaller stakes. He had no idea how different this room was going to be. The pre-acquisition board session took place 2 weeks before the main investor presentation. It was a smaller, internal gathering, senior leadership, a few key board members, and representatives from the acquiring company doing their initial due diligence review. I was not originally on the attendance list. Ms. Abara quietly added me as a supporting resource 48 hours before the meeting. Mr. Doyle noticed when he saw the updated list. He sent me a brief, carefully worded message asking about my role in the session. I replied that I was there to answer any technical or process questions that arose about departmental work. Neutral. Appropriate. Unchallengeable. He did not object. He could not object without raising questions about why he would want to exclude someone with direct knowledge of the material being discussed. I arrived early. I sat at the end of the table with my laptop open and my master documentation folder ready on the screen but not yet displayed. I had a printed copy in the bag beside my chair. Mr. Doyle entered, looked at me, and gave a brief professional nod. I nodded back. He was going to present. I was going to sit quietly and take careful mental notes of every misstatement and every claim that I could directly and specifically contradict with time-stamped evidence. The room settled. The session began. During the board session, Mr. Nwosu's audit team submitted their preliminary findings to the legal department. I knew this because Ms. Farrow, who had been in quiet contact with the company's internal legal counsel, sent me a brief message: prelim audit results are with legal. Every document checked out exactly as expected. I read the message under the table and put my phone face down. The legal team had now independently verified what I had known all along. Every email trail, every signed memo, every workflow blueprint, every strategic framework, all of it confirmed that I had designed the critical processes at the center of this acquisition's value proposition. The documentation was clean, precise, and completely consistent. Mr. Doyle was presenting in that same session as if none of this was happening. He was composed and fluent. He talked about the company's strategic direction with the ease of someone who believed the ground beneath him was solid. But legal now had the audit results. And the acquiring company's representatives in the room were asking the kind of detailed, specific questions that due diligence always produces, questions that required real, specific answers, not polished generalities. I watched Mr. Doyle answer each one. He was good. I will not pretend otherwise. He was experienced and practiced and could navigate ambiguity with real skill. But ambiguity was running out fast. The main investor presentation was held on a Thursday morning in the company's largest conference room. The room had been prepared carefully, printed materials at every seat, screens on 2 walls, water and coffee arranged on a side table. It felt important in the way that only rooms prepared for genuinely significant outcomes do. The acquiring company sent 5 representatives. 3 board members attended. 2 external financial advisors sat along the side wall. Mr. Doyle stood at the front looking exactly as he always did in important rooms, assured, polished, completely in command of the space. He opened the presentation and moved through the first section smoothly. Company overview. Market positioning. Growth trajectory. Standard material, cleanly delivered. Then he moved into the second section. Operational architecture. Client integration systems. Strategic frameworks underpinning the acquisition value. My work. He was describing it fluently, using the exact language I had used in the original documents, explaining the logic of systems I had spent months designing. And his name was on every slide. One of the acquiring company's representatives, a sharp, unhurried woman named Ms. Patel, raised her hand before he finished the 3rd slide. Can you walk us through the decision architecture behind the client risk framework? She asked. Specifically the weighting methodology. Mr. Doyle paused. Just briefly. Just long enough to tell me something. He answered Ms. Patel's question. But the answer was general where it needed to be specific. It used the right vocabulary but did not demonstrate the underlying reasoning. It was the answer of someone who had read a document carefully rather than the answer of someone who had built it from the ground up. Ms. Patel wrote something in her notebook. She did not follow up immediately. She let the presentation continue. I sat at the end of the table and said nothing. My hands were flat on the surface. My face was neutral. My breathing was even. Mr. Doyle continued through the presentation. 2 more of the acquiring company's representatives asked questions. His answers followed the same pattern, fluent on the surface, shallow underneath. Each time, the questioner made a note and moved on. The room had not erupted. No one had stood up and pointed a finger. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. But I could feel the quality of attention in the room shifting. The representatives from the acquiring company were experienced evaluators. They had spent careers sitting in rooms exactly like this one, asking exactly these kinds of questions, specifically to find the difference between someone who understood a system and someone who was describing it secondhand. They were finding that difference right now. And they had not yet asked me anything. That was about to change. Near the end of the second section, Mr. Doyle referenced a specific client positioning model and described it as the product of leadership-level strategic development over the past 18 months. One of the acquiring company's senior representatives, a quiet man named Mr. Stein who had barely spoken until this point, leaned forward slightly and said, "We received preliminary materials from this company about 8 months ago. In those materials, this model was introduced by a Marcus Reed. Is that the same model?" The room shifted. Several heads turned. Not dramatically. Just a small, precise movement of people recalibrating. Mr. Doyle smiled. He said something about the model having evolved significantly through leadership input since its initial development. Mr. Stein looked down at his folder. He removed a single printed page and set it on the table in front of him without saying anything further. I recognized the document from across the table. It was a copy of the original briefing I had submitted 8 months ago. My name was on the header. My signature was at the bottom. Mr. Doyle saw it too. I watched the color in his face change, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone in the room. But I was watching carefully, and I saw it. He tried to redirect to the next slide. Ms. Patel spoke before he could advance it. Mr. Reed, she said, looking directly at me, you available to clarify the development history of this model? Before I could respond, the door opened. Kofi, the junior member of my former team who had messaged me after the department closure, stepped inside. He had a folder under his arm. He looked at the room, found Mr. Doyle's face, and then looked at the investors. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said. I was asked by the legal team to deliver this directly to the board. He placed the folder on the table near Ms. Abera and stepped back. Ms. Abera opened it. She reviewed the top page. Then she looked up. This is a summary of the preliminary audit findings, she said to the room. It includes workflow documentation and authorship records for the systems being discussed in this presentation. She paused. The audit confirms that the client integration framework, the risk-weighting model, and the strategic positioning architecture were all originally developed and submitted by Marcus Reed. She set the folder down. The silence that followed was the kind I had been waiting for. Not the silence of confusion or embarrassment. The silence of a room where the last piece of information has just arrived and everyone is processing what it means. Mr. Doyle opened his mouth. He closed it. Kofi, standing quietly near the door, gave me the smallest nod I have ever seen a person give. I gave him the same one back. The questions that followed were not aggressive. They were precise. And precise questions, when the person being asked them does not have precise answers, are more damaging than any amount of shouting. Ms. Patel asked Mr. Doyle to walk through the decision points in the client segmentation model, specifically the 3 variables used to determine tier assignment. He explained them in general terms. She asked which of the 3 had been weighted most heavily and why. He said it depended on the client context. She asked him to give a specific example from the original development process. He could not. Mr. Stein asked about the workflow sequencing in the integration architecture. Specifically, he asked why a particular step had been placed before another one that would seem logically to come first. Mr. Doyle said the sequence had been the result of iterative team discussion. Mr. Stein looked at the audit document. The original submission shows a note here from Marcus Reed explaining the exact reasoning for that sequencing decision. Would you like to walk us through that reasoning? Mr. Doyle looked at the document. He looked at Mr. Stein. He began to speak and then stopped. Each answer that failed made the next question more pointed. Each gap in his knowledge made my presence at the end of the table more significant. The investors were not speaking to me yet. But they were building toward it, question by question, with the patient precision of people who already knew where they were going. The moment arrived quietly, the way the most significant moments usually do. Ms. Patel looked down the table at me. Not at Mr. Doyle. Not at Ms. Abera. At me. She held up the printed briefing document that Mr. Stein had placed on the table earlier, the one with my name on the header and my signature at the bottom. Mr. Reed, she said, this document introduces the foundational model for the client integration strategy. Can you tell us about the thinking behind it? Where it came from? What problem it was designed to solve? I had waited a long time for a question that was simply, tell me about your work. I answered fully. I explained the problem I had identified in the company's existing client management approach. I described the research phase, how long it took, what data I was working with, what the gaps were that I was trying to close. I walked through the architecture of the model, explaining each element and the reasoning behind it. I gave the specific example Mr. Stein had asked about, the sequencing decision, and explained exactly why I had structured it that way and what would have gone wrong if I had not. The room listened without interruption for 6 minutes. When I finished, Ms. Patel looked at Mr. Stein. He gave a small nod. Mr. Doyle was standing at the front of the room with his presentation still on the screen behind him. He had not said a word in over 10 minutes. Toward the end of the session, Mr. Doyle approached me in the corridor outside the conference room. The investors were still inside, reviewing materials with Ms. Abera and the legal representative. Mr. Doyle came toward me with the deliberate walk of a man trying to appear in control of a situation he had clearly lost control of. He spoke in a low voice. Marcus, I think there's been a misunderstanding about how credit and ownership have been represented here. I looked at him steadily. It would be in everyone's interest, he continued, if we could find a way to frame this as a collaborative development process going forward. Given the acquisition timeline. I have the original documents, I said. My voice was quiet. Even. I have the submission timestamps, the email trails, the audit findings, and written confirmation from Ms. Farrow's Office of Legal Authorship. All of it is already with the board. He stopped talking. There is nothing left to reframe, I said. His face went pale in a way I had not seen before. Not the pale of anger. The pale of a man who has just understood, fully and completely, that the story he has been telling has no more room to run. That every exit has already been closed. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor. I watched him go. I felt nothing dramatic. Just the clean, quiet feeling of something ending exactly the way it should. When the formal session resumed, Ms. Aber addressed the room directly. She had been careful and measured throughout the entire process. She had not made accusations. She had not performed outrage. But standing at the front of the conference room with the audit folder open in front of her, she was precise and completely clear. She confirmed that the legal and audit review had established the original authorship of every major system and framework presented in the acquisition materials. She confirmed that internal documentation had been altered in ways that removed accurate attribution. She named the audit findings specifically. Then she stated, for the record, that the misrepresentation of authorship in a document prepared for investor review constituted a serious breach of internal governance policy. 2 board members asked questions. Both were answered with direct references to the documentation. There was no ambiguity left in the room. Every answer pointed to the same place. Mr. Doyle sat through this without speaking. His usual ease was completely gone. Around him, the people who had publicly supported his decisions over the past year were very quiet and very still. The kind of quiet that comes from people who are rapidly calculating what they had agreed to and what that now means. The room had made up its mind. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just with the quiet, absolute certainty of people who have seen the evidence and can no longer pretend otherwise. The acquisition announcement was made the following Tuesday at a formal press event attended by both companies, board members, and a room full of investors and media representatives. At the end of the prepared remarks, during the question period, one of the acquiring company's board members, Mr. Osei, the same man who had mentioned my name at the informal investor event weeks earlier, was given the floor. He spoke about the value proposition of the acquisition. He spoke about the operational infrastructure that had made it compelling. And then, in front of everyone in that room, he said, the strategic frameworks at the heart of this partnership were developed by Marcus Reed, whose work has been central to the company's operational value for the past 5 years. He said it simply. Like a fact. Because it was. I was sitting 3 rows back. I did not stand up. I did not speak. I simply sat with my hands in my lap and let the words land in the room the way truth lands when it finally has the space to be said out loud. Mr. Doyle was on the stage. I did not look at him directly. But I saw, in my peripheral vision, the way his posture changed when Mr. Osei spoke those words. The way he became very still. The way the stage, which had always felt like his natural environment, suddenly looked like somewhere he did not quite belong. The applause that followed was for the acquisition. But some of it, I knew, was for something else entirely. The formal consequences came in stages over the following 2 weeks. HR and the executive committee reviewed the audit findings and the legal assessment. Mr. Doyle was formally placed on administrative review. Within 10 days he had been removed from his CEO role pending a governance investigation. The board issued a statement about misrepresentation of intellectual contributions in acquisition materials, which was careful language for what had actually happened. My name was restored in all official acquisition documentation. The record was corrected publicly in the materials submitted to the acquiring company. Then the offers began arriving. Ms. Patel's firm reached out through formal channels, expressing interest in bringing me on as a strategic consultant for the integration process. Mr. Osei's investment group sent a letter through their legal team proposing a senior advisory relationship. 2 executives from the acquiring company requested meetings directly. Kofi was promoted to lead a newly formed team. I made sure to tell the board that his integrity throughout the process had been significant and should be recognized. They agreed. Pete came by my desk one afternoon and set a coffee down without saying anything. Then he said, "I knew you had it." "You were worried," I said. "I was terrified," he said. "But I knew." I accepted the senior project lead role that the company offered. Not because I needed the validation, but because the work was real and the foundation was mine and I had every intention of building on it. Several weeks later, I was in my office in the early evening. Most of the building had emptied out. The city outside my window was doing what cities do, moving, glowing, entirely indifferent to the specific human dramas happening inside the buildings it contains. I was not reviewing documents. I did not have a meeting scheduled. I was simply sitting in a chair in an office that had my name on the door and thinking about the 5 years that had led to this particular evening. I thought about the first time a proposal had been taken from me and presented under someone else's name. The small, sick feeling of watching it happen and not knowing what to do about it. I thought about the night I decided to stop reacting and start building, to turn every act of erasure into a piece of documented evidence that could not be denied. I thought about Mr. Doyle presenting my work in that first conference room and calling what I had built useless, and I thought about how completely and permanently wrong he had been. He had tried to make me disappear. He had used the tools available to him, authority, access, position, and he had used them carefully and consistently. But he had made one fundamental mistake. He had assumed that because he could remove my name from a document, he had removed the truth of who had created it. He had not. Truth does not need its name on the page to remain true. It waits. Quietly. Patiently. Until the room is ready to hear it. I looked out at the city lights and felt, finally, completely at rest.